Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tunde Olatunji. I'm the Associate Director of Policy here at the Africa Center. And we're going to get started in a second, but right before we do, just a few words about the Africa Center for those joining us for the first time. We're a multidisciplinary institution. We're engaged in the fields of arts, policy, and business, and are focused primarily on narrative change around the continent of Africa. So for us, we think it's important what kind of information gets to shape the world's understanding of the place and its people, but also who gets to communicate that information. So we work to center perspectives from and of the continent in conversations that pertain to them specifically. And so as part of that work, we put on public programs such as this one today, which is on recent legislation that has been passed in Uganda. This discussion is a little unique for us because we don't usually have specific pieces of legislation as our topic of discussion, but it seems really obvious to us that the effects of these laws are fairly sweeping, and people will see its effects manifest in their lives across, I think, a range of social spheres. And I think it's important to understand what exactly it is that we're dealing with. And so to help us do that, we are joined by our expert panel, experts both on the issues and on the context. First, we have Richard Lusimbo, who is the founder and director general of the Uganda Key Populations Consortium, and among many other things, is renowned for his work in human rights and health services activism, and as a prominent advocate for the LGBTQ plus community in Uganda. Next, we have Dr. Catherine Kyobutungi, who is the executive director of the African Population and Health Center, a health research center in Nairobi, excuse me. She previously serves as the center's director of research and head of research unit on health and health systems for health. She has a background in medical sciences and is a trained epidemiologist with research interests in the interface between non-communicable diseases and health system strengthening. Last but not least, we have Gloria Mugabekazi, who is an African feminist writer and development strategist whose work is premised on challenging systemic injustice across Africa. She currently works as a program officer in Uganda for Africa's first indigenous activist-led and managed fund for and by sex workers and sex and gender minorities. Thank you all for joining us today. If you don't mind, I think we're just going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to start with you, Richard, if I could. A lot of this discussion is going to center around this very specific slate of legislation. And I think just to start, it will be good if you could give us a sense and just summarize sort of what this legislation is, who it presumes to target, and sort of what kind of penalties it imposes on people.
Thanks so much, Tunde, and I'm honored to share this platform with colleagues, Dr. Catherine Kyobutungi and Gloria, and again, everyone who is listening in now. Thanks so much. We find ourselves again with almost 10 years later with another anti-homosexuality law in Uganda, given the fact that the very first one, which was commonly known as the Kill the Gays Bill of 2009, that was first tabled in 2009 and then passed in 2013 and signed into law by the president in 2014. And as advocates, we worked so hard, went to the Constitutional Court, and it was nullified. And what we see now, again, which is now known as the Anti-Homosexuality Act 2023, is another legislation that actually comes to take away the rights of the LGBT community in Uganda, but also targeting anyone who is providing even a health service or even providing shelter to any individual who identifies as LGBT, but also one of the toughest laws, anti-LGBT laws that we have seen in a lifetime, whereby it really criminalizes everything, while it doesn't criminalize for one to identify as LGBT, everything around who you are, how you socialize, how you engage, but also how even people get into contact with the community, or even, like I mentioned earlier, to support giving a health service or promises for housing, but also leaves so many questions because, again, there's a lot of ambiguity when it comes to the definition of the different clauses like promotion that are in this law. And when you look at the penalties or the offenses, there's a clause that talks about the offense of homosexuality, which has a punishment for life imprisonment. And this is focusing if one is LGBT and engaging in consensual sexual activity. This, again, if charged, then you'll be facing life imprisonment. There's also what they call attempted homosexuality, which calls for up to 10 years in prison. This could be when a person of the same sex or two people of the same sex are exposed, and even when they may not be actively engaging in any sexual act, this could lead to 10 years in prison if they are charged. We have also what termed as attempted aggravated homosexuality that calls for 14 years imprisonment. Then there's also the offense of breach of confidentiality, and this is what they term as exposing the identity of a victim of homosexuality. And again, this carries a fine of 5 million Ugandan shillings. There's also what they call child grooming, which calls for life imprisonment. Again, these are some of the offenses, but also the other round promises that if a landlord gave a house or a hotel or a space, for example, an openly gay person, and they do not report them because it's assumed that you are committing offenses that have been already penalized in this act, then that landlord or individuals will face 7 years of jail. But also it outlaws same-sex marriages, and anyone involved and caught faces 10 years imprisonment. And then, of course, which also that I had alluded to, is the promotion of homosexuality that calls for 20 years imprisonment for individuals, and for organizations or corporate entities. We're looking at a very big chunk of fines and lots of monies that are involved, including suspension of licenses for organizations or corporates for a period of 10 years, or even canceling it. But also the duty to report acts of homosexuality. Again, this is creating a police state. And this, again, if you do not report, those who do not report and engage in sexual acts with children or vulnerable persons are liable to a fine of 100 million Ugandan shillings or imprisonment of 5 years. So as you can see, the offenses and the penalties in this act are very severe, but also there's a lot of ambiguity in terms of what is defined as promotion. But also it creates a state of policing where people are going to be policing each other, or is that are you engaging in homosexuality? But also it could create a moment where people, I don't like Richard, then I'm just going to report that Richard is gay, and there will be no investigations, and before they know it, I'll be in jail. And again, this is the kind of fear that we've been really pushing and talking about, but also it really leads to many levels of creating a lot of pride and prejudice in the service sector, especially access to health services. And these are some of the concerns that we continue to really speak out, because again, even from the very start, we did not need and we do not deserve such a law in Uganda or anywhere else. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. And I think, yeah, that was one of the things that struck me initially. And I can't imagine this was by accident, was just how broad and I think vague a lot of a lot of these laws that like the promotion of homosexuality and having a 20-year penalty, that feels like it could be interpreted in just a wide range of ways and could put people under serious legal penalty for really at the discretion of whomever, right? And you had spoken to this a bit, but I wanted to get more towards that. So how a law like this comes to be, right? So Uganda is a presidential democracy. They have a legislature, and there is a very clear legal process for how laws can be passed. This all went through the normal lines of sort of development, right? It passed through the House, the Senate, and the president signed it, right? Was there any lack of transparency in the process?
No, thank you so much, Tunde. And again, um, this is a very interesting question. I must say that in record time, this bill went through Parliament and it became law, like something we've never seen before. Usually, when for example, there's what we call a private member's bill. This is where a member of parliament seeks leave from parliament to go and draft a bill and then return to parliament. Or sometimes the government can bring bills, but this particularly was a private member's bill. And when usually it takes around 30 days or plus, and then they come back to the House. But what we saw with this particular bill is that when the member of parliament who was given or granted leave went and then they returned immediately, the bill was being discussed even because usually they are supposed to they're supposed to have public hearings. But unfortunately, we didn't even see a lot of public engagement on this particular bill, whereby parliament or committees have over 40 days of hearings. In record time, I think this bill only was in a couple of days and the hearing was closed. And then we're having the discussion on the floor of parliament. But also, one other thing that I really saw that was very interesting, but also disheartening at the same time, was the debate. The kind and nature of the debate that was in parliament was really troubling, because you'd imagine parliament would base and build laws of a country like Uganda basing on our constitution, which we all cherish, the 1995 constitution. But looking at the debate, much of the debate was around personal sentiments, religious sentiments, and a lot of it also with a lot of vagueness, but also a lot of language that was very derogatory in terms of the definitions that were being discussed and how people are really discussing on the floor of parliament. But also the conduct, really seeing from the speaker's point of view that the speaker was in more or less really just wanting to hear from one side and maybe not even give a chance to the other side of labor protection. So again, that really shows that this bill, while we appreciate that the legislature has the role and duty to set and build up laws of our country, I think this must be done in a nature that is objective, because the discussion around this bill, it was not objective at all. And again, even when they sent it to the president and then the president sent it back, there was even no time to discuss. And then there we are again back in parliament and boom, it was passed. So again, it really showed that our legislatures or members of parliament were speaking more to populistic kind of propaganda and driving through people's and community emotions. And again, they saw this bill as a law that is coming to protect children. But if you really look at our constitution and the laws that we have for children protection, this has nothing to do with the protection of children, but rather taking away the rights of LGBT identifying Ugandans. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it does seem like it would appear that there were some irregularities with the process. And Gloria, if I could come to you really quickly, maybe not quickly, please take as much time as you want. But uh, this isn't the first time that a law like this or a law with similar objectives has come through the legislature in Uganda. Could you please speak to prior efforts that have been undertaken that maybe are in the same vein? This sort of anti-LGBTQ agenda is not new by any means, right?
Right. Thank you so much, Tunde, and thank you, Richard. Hi, everybody. I'm really glad to be here amongst all these amazing experts and minds. And to just go back to Tunde's question around how this has evolved, right? I think that Richard sort of alluded to that in his conversation from the time of Kill the Gay Bill in 2009, which was later challenged in 2014. And I think the biggest win back then in 2014 was that there were some gaps that as activists and people that were petitioning against the bill and the challenges could use that have been really tightened this time round. I'll take an example of the provision around the bill was criminalizing the act of homosexuality as compared to the bill now of 2023, which is criminalizing identity, and among other provisions that Richard has spoken about, like aggravated homosexuality, which warrants death penalty, and other really draconian measures that have been mentioned. And even as we speak about the anti-homosexuality bill, I just want us to remember that Uganda is heavily a religious country. Most of our laws, most of our policies are steeply dipped in religion, but also in quote unquote cultural values and moral values. And so most of the legislation around sexuality or even bodily autonomy is biased to that effect. And because of this, we have seen so many other bills and acts and policies that have come out to silence people's voices, to erase people's identities from the community. I'll speak briefly also about other laws and policies of this nature that have come up in the past. In 2019, we had a sexual offenses bill, which was really also a bill that, among so many other things that were, I think, great and important, it was protecting children against pornography, against tourism pornography, against rape and defilement. But within that same bill, again, there was clauses around laws against the order of nature, quote unquote, laws, prohibition and provisions against same-sex marriage, which really, again, was also in a way to criminalize LGBTQI persons. But also within the same bill, when I talk about how Uganda, quote unquote, laws are really guided or misguided by religion and culture, is that in the same bill, we're discussing consent. And I mean, this is 2019. And this bill still came again in 2021, and we're still discussing consent. And it was very disheartening to see people, grown men, grown women, to stand in parliament and discuss consent as using analogies of a plane taking off and then not being able to land immediately, because to their understanding and their expertise, which we have seen over the years that keeps showing up in these laws that we get, was that consent cannot be withdrawn during intimacy or sexual act, which again reflects on the people that are making these laws. And I remember I was organizing and coordinating with other feminist organizers within the movement, and we were appalled that we had to hold these conversations with MPs, members of parliament, women members of parliament around consent, something that we should be able to really dissect and learn. And then again, we still see these relics of religion and quote unquote African values and cultures spill and show up in the ways in which comprehensive sexuality education is framed in Uganda. I believe that the guidelines we have are as old as 2017, but still they do not explicitly talk about sex or sexuality, again, under the pretext that we are diluting our morals. We are not protecting our children. Right. Yet we all know that, with the right information, our children will be able to make the right decisions and also protect themselves. And I'm saying all of this just to really show how the conversation of anti-LGBTQI Act is not existing in a vacuum. We are existing in a moralist country that is led by moralist policymakers. Because when you think about it, the Anti-Homosexuality Act in 2023 was passed by 73% of the members of parliament. And that really reflects on how our society thinks. We've seen a couple of other policies that creep up, the anti-pornography bill that really came and caused so much violence and harm on women and girls in Uganda, because this was something that was weaponizing public judgment around decent dressing or just really, reinforcing sexualization and objectification of women. So then fast forward, we're in 2023 and we're still seeing these relics of really anti-LGBTQI, homophobia, sexist, just creep up into laws like this, which has been passed, and it's very draconian in ways that Richard has already alluded to. Right. So yeah, we keep seeing that happening, and I know that we're going to keep seeing more of these kinds of acts come up. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. And I think, I think the effect on sort of morals and how these morals are being determined, I think we'll get into that going forward. But Dr. Catherine, I just wanted to come to you, and I think we've discussed what this law means and what the consequences are in a legal sense, right? So you go to jail for X number of years, or there's a death penalty. But it would seem with the law like this, the consequences or the effects, I think, are a lot broader than just in the legal sense. And I was hoping you could kind of walk us through what other ways you could see a law like this, or these kinds of laws, the effects manifest themselves in people's social lives.
Thanks so much, Tunde, and also happy to be here. So thanks for the opportunity to discuss this law. Interestingly, I was already seeing the effects of this law from a public health perspective, but of course there are many other ramifications, as you've heard. And initially, when the initial draft of the law, the crime was actually sexual orientation. And then it went back, the president said, no, it's the act, not the orientation. However, they introduced the clause on intent. So if somebody has reasonable suspicion that you intend to commit the sexual act, then that also is criminalized. So in essence, that's what Richard was saying. If there's a gay couple that lives in a house, there's an assumption they're going to have sex. So the assumption they're going to have sex now is also a crime, because you have to prove you're not going to have sex. Now that is so it almost went back to criminalize orientation. And when you think about the public health ramifications, adding a provision for the obligation to report, it means that if a gay man went to a clinic and said, I want condoms, then the healthcare provider has reasonable suspicion they're going to have sex, and therefore they should report that this person is going to commit a crime, which is the sexual act itself. Now, there's already anecdotes, and there's already a report about specific clinics that were dealing with members of the LGBT community, specifically men who have sex with men, they have a specific sort of framing around that, especially in the context of the HIV/AIDS, control. Clinics which have been abandoned, which are seeing 50 clients per day, now they're seeing 2, they're seeing 3, because people are afraid if I show up, the healthcare worker has an obligation to report me. And these healthcare workers know that these individuals, are homosexual. So there's that very direct effect. Now, of course, having said that, this is a clinic which was there and everybody knew that the clinic was there, but people seek care in many different ways. So it's the same thing like if somebody went to seek care and has an STI, that clearly was a result of anal sex, then the healthcare worker is obliged to report. Of course, they may not. People are saying, no, they will not, but you don't know that. Why would you risk being reported? And if you went back for treatment the second time, now that is repeat offense, and that's the one which is, you are liable to the death penalty. So it's going to affect the ability of some individuals in our community to access healthcare services. That is at, I would say, a micro level. Now, the worst thing is that, doctor-patient confidentiality has been protected in ethics, and now people who break that, the law protects them. So you're not liable to any kind of consequence if you're a doctor and you break that. If you report your patient, there's a provision to protect you from any consequence. So it's almost as if it's like blocking every single avenue that somebody who is a member of the LGBTQI community has to seek care in privacy, with confidentiality, without fear for their lives or without fear of being, outed and being stigmatized by the community. So but that's a very micro, in a way, that's a micro consequence.
Do you mind if we stick with this micro consequence for a second? Just in a practical sense, what then happens? Though, say you live in a country, you live in a world where healthcare services providing you with care is a crime for them. There's no realistic expectation of care. What do you do in that sense? What happens to, because the health that the needs don't go away because the access isn't there, right? So what happens?
I mean, I think that's part of the problem because access has always been problematic. Access by the LGBTI community has always been problematic. And in spite of all these special, measures, it is considered the key population because it is stigmatized. When there's stigma, then of course people don't access care the way they should. And so when you think about even the prevalence of HIV in this community is higher, the incidence is higher. So there are many other things which are already there. Now the system is being tightened and access made even more difficult. So that's the question. If you're somebody who maybe was getting ARVs and now you're afraid that if you go and get ARVs, you're going to be arrested. That is, we are yet to see what the potential consequences are, because the reason why LGBTQ community is considered the key population, part of it because of intense social stigma. There are several individuals who have, I would say, double lives. Society expects them to be married, so they marry, they have families, and then they have a second life, if I could call it that. So there's a certain link between that community with the general population. And from a public health perspective, that's important. But now you're saying in this population with the high prevalence, with the high incidence, you're depriving and taking away the opportunity for care, for prevention, for staying on treatment if they are HIV positive so that they can suppress their viral load. And then now they are connecting back to the main population. So there are many other things which will take years to explore, to quantify about that. But I think as you're asking the question, if you're somebody who you have a routine, you know that every Monday or every month, on a certain day, I go to a clinic, I see my doctor, you have a relationship, you have trust, and now all of a sudden you're not even sure whether you should show up, because if they see you, they know you, whether they will call the police while you're still seeking care. I can't imagine what that's like, just not knowing that you need life-saving care, you can't get it because the alternative is being arrested and spending years in prison. And then, of course, perhaps being exposed and going viral on social media about something that you went to seek care. Yeah. So it's
basic public needs. Yeah, it is really it does blow the mind a little bit. And I want to come back and speak about the discourse again just for a minute, and I'll come back to you, Gloria, as well. But just Dr. Catherine, I want to disapproval of this bill, I think, was pretty swift, I think, from a broad group of people. I think global health groups, you saw foreign governments come in, but I think within the country, I think a lot of the response I've been getting, at least from members of parliament, has been that a big bulk of this opposition has been from outside agitators. It's foreigners who disapprove of this. And so we will not bow to the pressure. We as Ugandans know what we believe. We want to do this. What did you take on this? Do you think this is reflective of general sentiment? And how do people feel about this bill?
I mean, I've seen reports of surveys which show that 95% of the Ugandan population support the bill and all that, but that's not the point. The point is there are things you don't put to a majority vote. Yeah. I would say that a lot of Ugandans maybe are sexist. It doesn't mean sexism is okay. A lot of Ugandans are okay. You had the debate about consent, that they don't think you can withdraw consent. It doesn't make it okay. There are studies which show that lots of women think it's okay for their husbands to beat them. It doesn't make it okay. So there are things which cannot just be legislated because the public wants them. And that's a slippery slope that I don't think many people realize. If you give power to parliament to legislate on fundamental human rights, that could be extrapolated to many other things. In future, it could be we don't like short people and the majority don't like short people. Then what? Are you going to accept that because the majority said so? So the point is not whether the bill has popular support. Of course, it does for many reasons, which is like shocking. I think maybe that was the worst. I mean, I just imagine like what kind of country is this where 95% of people think this is okay? And so that is a different dynamic that we have to deal with in the long term. But the point is there are things which are not up for legislation and which are not subject to a majority opinion. And I think somebody said constitutions exist to protect the minority from the tyranny of the majority. And this is a typical example. Now, I think Gloria was talking about, no, I think it was Richard was talking about how this bill was rushed. I am on a group of the Uganda Medical Association. The Uganda Medical Association got a request to submit their position at around 10 p.m. And they're supposed to submit it at 2 p.m. the next day. So people are working through the night, putting together a position. I was getting emails at 11 p.m. to contribute a draft document, and at 12 p.m. the next day, at 11 a.m. the next day, to contribute a draft that was hurriedly slapped together with all sorts of things, typos, there was simply no time. And these people are supposed to show up in parliament at 2 p.m. the next day and present the position of the Uganda Medical Association. And of course, they showed up and presented. But that's the whole thing. What is the rush? The Uganda Medical Association could have had a medical opinion based on research and evidence and all this, but they were just given hours to prepare a position, and they went and presented. And of course, a lot of what they said, I don't think it was even taken into consideration. But that's the point of what is this rush that you must legislate something that has impact on people's lives and do it in such a hurried manner without due consideration to process.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And I think you're absolutely right, The entire point of the essence of fundamental human rights is the fact that they're not negotiable, regardless of what the majority might think. And yeah, not everything should be up for public debate, certainly. Gloria, just to get a sense of the sort of camps that people have fallen under being, I think you on issues like this, on bills like this, you often have political interest groups or activist groups or people in opposition or in support of a bill. And I was just wondering if you have a sense of where people have fallen on both sides of this debate. Where we seeing what groups are we seeing come out and champion the bill or champion opposition to the bill? Are the usual suspects in terms of groups who are usually championing for social and human rights, are they also out in number? What does it look like in Uganda today?
Thank you, Tunde, and just give me a minute as I get my niece out of my sight.
No worries.
Just a minute.
While we wait for Gloria, actually, we can
Sorry, I wanted to add something.
Yeah, please
I wanted to add something. And in a way, this is an issue which is stigmatized, highly stigmatized. It's an issue where people face consequences for speaking out. So why would you be surprised that people are not speaking out? I don't even know like why people would expect that Ugandans, there are some brave Ugandans like Richard here was sticking their necks out. But other people are not that brave, because if you speak out and stick your neck out and then you're labeled, then when people are being threatened on social media, we shall come for you, we shall find you in your house, we shall ban you, we shall kill you. So why would people be surprised that it's people who are not in Uganda who are speaking out, or people like Richard who lead certain organizations and maybe who are brave enough to speak out? So you can't threaten people and then be surprised that they're not speaking. They are gay Ugandans. That is what I keep telling people. And it doesn't matter how many they are, even though it's 1% of the population, even though they're 100, they're still Ugandans, and they have as much rights to exist in Uganda as every other person, regardless of what the majority think. So they are Ugandans there, but they can't speak out because they're terrified.
I think that's an important thing to note. Also, I think there's an effort, there's an ability to sort of muddy the waters in terms of, look, they're not getting support from X group because they don't believe in, they're not aligned on these issues. But I think to your point, I think the amount of support that you're able to see within Uganda is very much limited by the knowledge that the blowback will be severe and it can be more costly than we maybe give it credit for. But Gloria, please, if you could maybe give us a sense of what groups are involved in this movement.
Yeah, I would not really differ from Dr. Catherine. I think that there is, the risk is heavy. You cannot speak out if you know that you're going to be imprisoned, if you're going to be alienated from your family. So I understand that some people have not been speaking out, but on the bright side, I think that one of the things that we have registered tremendously between now and 2014 is that the community has grown, right, since 2014 to now. I remember back in 2014, however much young I was in my activism, I remember that the movement was mainly led by allies, and rightly so, because at the time, the movement or the community, the LGBTQI community, was still very young or nascent in terms of organizing and movement building. But one of the things that we have seen now is that we have people like Richard Lusimbo, people like Frank, people like Claire. We have a couple of individuals that have been doing this work even before the bill came. So where we are now, by the time the bill came, we had already over 100 organizations, LGBTQI identifying organizations in the country. We have networks of Uganda key populations. We have networks of sexual minorities Uganda group and other networks that are really connected to the movement and that have been organizing. So much as it is all gloom and fear right now, I think that the fact that the movement and the community is at the forefront of this and saying that we are taking the narrative and we're owning the narrative and we're also reshaping the narrative. We have the Convening for Equality, to which Richard is one of the co-conveners, and I believe that he will speak a lot more to that, which is really bringing together all community members across the country to say that, hey, look, if you're working alone, if you're an organization that has been, locked down and evicted, it's going to be hard for you to actually do this work. But if we're doing this together with other people that have a certain access to, resources and networks, it will be easier for us to register some wins. So I believe that there has been real such coordination for the Ugandan movement. But I also think that most of the support keeps coming also from Ugandans and people in the diaspora, again, alluding to security and the risk of being an individual activist at the forefront of this when you're in the country. So I understand why we keep seeing a lot more support from Africans and Ugandans in the diaspora. But I would also like to say that I have been quite impressed by the young people in Uganda. I believe that right now, the conversation around anti-homosexuality is not a moral conversation. It's not a public conversation within the younger population, because I believe that there are more pressing issues that they're facing right now, and also because they have seen the hypocrisy and the double standards of the government, but also they've been let down a lot by the government. So for them to come out and start, contributing to this narrative, it's not something that I see a lot within the younger community and the younger people of Uganda, as compared to 2014, where everybody was just thrown off by the entire topic of LGBTQI persons. So I see that has been really growing. To the government response, I do not believe that we are going to see much response from there. Recently, we got a circular from the Ministry of Health that that stands against discrimination of people that are supposed to be accessing services. And this came after the bill had been signed and assented to, which in and of itself is pointless, because if already there is a law that is criminalizing certain persons, that means they cannot access health services. Right. But I believe that, the ministry is doing this because it would not want to lose out on funding. It would not want to also lose out on public popularity and among other things. But I still believe that we have more work to do as a community.
Thank you so much, Gloria. That's really helpful. And I want to step out for a second and look at this from the perspective of the continent more generally, and come back to you, Richard. But before I ask you a question, Richard, we have about 30 more minutes of me as going on with the questions, but then we want to get into any questions that you might have in the audience. So if you can start thinking about those up, start doing that, and then we'll try to get to them at the end. But Richard, if I could come back to you, just Gloria had spoken about how the perspective of young people are sort of markedly different, and they are changing the landscape of how Africa as a whole feels about a lot of these critical issues. But I think the elephant in the room is, I think currently the continent is still fairly conservative on these issues. Right? I think as of today, 30 of the 54 African countries criminalize homosexuality in one way or another, right? So I think there is certainly work to be done on that front. And I wonder what you make of this and sort of the trending of Africa on this issue. Are we sort of softening on this? Are we getting better or worse, I guess is my question.
No, thanks so much again. And I must say, we didn't get here by mistake. As a continent, much of the time we lived under colonialism. And what colonialism left us when we became independent Africa was us adopting and embracing what is now known as the colonial legacy. And these are some of the laws. For example, the Penal Code that many African countries, especially from the Anglophone or that were former colonies or protectorates of UK or Britain, these were adopted in 1950s and others. And these laws, when countries like Uganda got independent, they still held on to these in the Penal Code, which were actually criminalizing consensual sex. So what we are seeing now is another chapter and angle, moving away from what we have been having on books. For example, we've seen countries like Botswana, Angola, Mozambique, Gabon that have decriminalized. And Gabon, Mozambique, and Angola, very interestingly, it's been processed through Parliament, where Parliament, when updating their laws, felt like these penal codes laws that were left by the colonialists do not have any chance to stand in independent countries like Angola, Mozambique, and Gabon. For countries like Botswana, it was through strategic litigation in courts of law. So there is hope that actually Africa will come to a moment of embracing diversity. But I think as we are getting to that level, we're also seeing lots of forces, especially being driven by American evangelicals, who are coming and defining what a family is. I must say that recently it was really interesting to see the leader of Family Watch International, Sharon Slater, in Uganda at the end of March, attending and speaking as a main speaker at a conference dubbed as African Family Values. And this had members of parliament from over 30 countries in Africa who were in Kampala. Now, you have an American coming to lecture Africans on African family values. That really says a lot. So the hate that you see now is not by surprise. It's the hate that is being imported. And like my colleague Frank has always said, homosexuality is African, but homophobia is what is un-African. And it is through some of these engagements by individuals, American evangelicals, that we've seen all these anti-LGBT sentiments on the rise. And they use the church and they use the power of donations. So they find a very fertile ground of convincing, making sure that everything they say becomes biblical and becomes the gospel truth. When you look at the anti-LGBT law in Ghana, it has the same language as that was in the anti-LGBT law that we had in 2014. And now, when you see even what Uganda now decided to do, it's not indifferent. It's the same that we're seeing being pushed across the border in Kenya. Again, same language. So this really shows you that we are dealing with forces that are coming in the name of protecting and pushing African values, but actually using what I prefer to call a lost cultural war in their own countries. We have seen different parts of the West that have become progressive on LGBT rights. And we have some people within those countries who feel they need to come to Africa to ensure that they insert themselves and push their own agendas. And I think this is where we find ourselves, that we are dealing with neocolonialism that comes in soft power, neocolonialism that comes in the name of supporting Africa to strengthen its values. But remember, there's nothing to learn from the West about African values, because harmony was the biggest principle. That just growing up, my grandmother would tell me, please, if someone angers you in the morning, by the time the sun goes down, make sure you've made peace. But look at what we are having now. You know, it was okay for us to hug, shake hands, but now Western culture is coming and telling us, oh, if two men hug, that is homosexuality. Excuse me. And why are we even allowing and facing this? So a lot what we're seeing right now, it's a lot of propaganda being pushed by all these American evangelicals, pushing their sentiments. But again, it's finding, and I've seen this most of the times, that minorities are always going to suffer at the expense of politicians who always want to pass and insert themselves into power. And I think this is what is really clearly showing that, yes, if you say that about our children, then we shall get the votes because we are going to be seen as people who are protecting children. But I mean, that's not what it is. Yeah, thanks.
No, thank you, Richard. I think that's really important. And I think when we were trying to come up with discussion questions for this, and we're thinking about the role of the international community in this, it got really complex, right? Because some of the loudest voices against this have been from the US, so to speak, but also you see, like you very clearly articulated, right? A lot of the forces that have worked towards getting Uganda to this point have also been these institutions that are based in the US as well. And I want to stick with this question of the international community and what role they can play in all of this. So like I said, the pressure has been as has been swift, it's been increasing. I think the US threatened to suspend visas for members of parliaments and things like that. And I wonder, to what extent do you think this kind of pressure will be telling, right? Because there was an earlier version of this bill, if I'm not mistaken, from March, that got vetoed by the president because of pressure, well, partly because of pressure that came from a lot of these international actors. So it would seem that he is susceptible to this kind of pressure. The government is susceptible to this kind of pressure. And I wonder how far does it matter what the rest of the world thinks? How much can they survive with the rest of the world thinking that this is wrong?
So one, Uganda does exist in this global village, and we cannot continue to do business as though we're just an island. We're a country that trades and has partnerships with other countries across the globe, in Africa, but also in the global north. And I think this is a point where, for example, the president comes in because you're not going to rule a country that has no access to foreign exchange or trade, because again, you want to have a country that is vibrant, but also has access to different markets. And I think this is why it's important to have these dialogues. But also, I want to come from a point of view that these different countries in the West that have spoken out, they do support different programs and have bilateral relationships with our government. But also remember, they have taxpayers who are always demanding to understand where the resources are going and with whom. And I think this is where the issue of questioning when a country like Uganda passes a legislation that is very draconian, that is taking away the rights of its own citizens, countries will always stand out. And again, Uganda belongs to the international family and community. We have signed on treaties that we're supposed to uphold as a country. And I think this is, again, something that is very key, even when these discussions are being made. And our government is always listening and looking onto that. And I think this is why we have seen the reaction that we have received and the reaction that we have also seen from our own government. And this is not going to change or end anytime soon unless legislation like the Anti-Homosexuality Act are not legislated or passed, because again, as a country, we have a role to play in the international scene, but also a role to play to ensure that we also adhere to international treaties and agreements that we sign to, because we don't just belong in isolation. And how this will play out, I think time shall tell. But I think the key thing is, let's always continue speaking out, and the international community should speak out the truth, because we do not identify or belong in isolation.
You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you. That's really well said, Richard. I want to, just because this is, I try to keep this as focus on the policy as much as I can. Dr. Catherine, I want to come back to this idea of this is and you have to forgive me, this is not directly related to your work, but I really am interested in your perspective on this, and just the idea of sort of this not having happened as a result of some popular uprising or some coup or some extrajudicial action, right? This was a law passed in a democratic country through democratic institutions with the blessing of the people, right? Yet at its core is this fundamentally anti-human rights action, this fundamentally anti-democratic action. And I just wonder how you're able to sort of square that with like a fundamental belief that like this is the system of government that is best for us, right? Yet it is through this same system that these, I think, quite honestly, deplorable things are being justified, right? So how do you square these things? I'm so sorry for this ridiculous question to bring to you.
I mean, I think that's something which is always an argument that says, oh, the majority of the Ugandans want it. The majority of parliamentarians voted for it. We voted for the parliamentarians to make laws. But it goes back to what I said earlier. There's a place for democracy. There's a place for majority opinion. That place exists, and it's not for things that go against human rights. I think that's the fundamental thing. So it's fine. Parliament is there to make laws. Let them make laws. But you can't make laws that sort of trample. You can't legislate as a country to trample the human rights of your people. And this is an argument actually when you think about the role of the international community, where some people have said that in some instances they have done harm more than good, because there's a narrative about how they scream the loudest when it comes to LGBTQ rights, but they don't scream when other rights are being trampled. The difference is Uganda does not legislate to do extrajudicial killings. Uganda does not legislate to beat up its opposition. It's not the law. So there's a difference between the government breaking the law that says don't beat up people who are demonstrating, and government sponsoring and legislating to break the law. So that's the difference. That's the international community cannot stand by while governments legislate to trample human rights. So as I said, it doesn't really matter that this is a democratic process. It is a democratic process, doing democratic things on the wrong things. But having said that, that's why there are three arms of government. There's the judiciary, and so the judiciary is now going to be an arbiter that says, yes, you have your right, you're there to legislate, but this time you made a bad law because maybe it's unconstitutional. If the judiciary sides with parliament, then of course it's what it is. The hope is that it doesn't. So parliament plays its role, but I don't think the reason why civil society exists, the reason why the judiciary exists is to say when parliament is out of line, then there's some process of bringing them back to line, because otherwise parliament would run riot doing what they want. And maybe they will say corruption is legal and then legislate and say it's legal and then everybody can do nothing about it. So it's fine. It's a democratic process. The majority of Ugandans support this horrible law, but it doesn't make it right that it shouldn't be challenged. And I think the grounds for challenging it is you cannot legislate to trample on fundamental human rights of citizens in your own country. I think for me that's the only argument. Now I wanted to say something about what Gloria said about this memo in the Ministry of Health. A few weeks ago, the president said, no, the law that I signed does not say this. It doesn't criminalize people. It doesn't. People are free to seek healthcare services, and apparently, on the basis of that, the Minister of Health sent a memo says, you see, the president said it, so it's fine that nobody's going to be discriminated. But the law that he signed has those provisions. So there are two things. It's almost like trying to have your cake and eat it. You sign a law that has certain provisions, and then you go in public and say, I never signed that law, even when there's evidence that you did. Then the Minister of Health now is trying to sort of assuage the concern by funders and donors for all these programs. So you see, the president said it. It's not what the president said, it's what's in the paper that he signed. Otherwise, why would people go to court if the law wasn't, trampling on people's human rights? So there's that's we need to understand, like, in a way, some of the politics. And the point that Richard made about the colonial legacy, actually, for me, the bigger problem is the legacy of the education system that has, it has deprived us of our history, has deprived us of our culture, and it keeps on perpetuating that whole, system that produces people that have been disempowered, that are conformists. So when you see the debates currently, and I'm not as optimistic about the younger generation because it has much more access to information, but still the arguments the younger generation has are not different from the older generation, which don't have as much information. And going back to the trends and things which are happening, I would say there's a bigger trend around monetizing information, around monetizing culture wars. And a lot of the arguments that Ugandans have on social media about this law are copy-pasted from the arguments that Americans are having. So there's like an information highway directly from the US exporting its culture wars, either through religious, the evangelicals, but also through other social media and all that. there's an information highway where the same arguments that are being made in the US right now against this whole transphobia, the same arguments are being directly exported to Uganda through WhatsApp, through YouTube, and through all these other channels. So there's a bigger force. Part of it is organized. You would say the genesis of this debate was through some kind of organization, but then it's being, I would say, fueled by other forces like disinformation, misinformation, monetizing culture wars, monetizing hate. And Africans, a lot of us are consuming that without thinking that actually there's a different force behind. There's a reason why a YouTube video made in the US becomes viral in Uganda and is shared many, many, many times on WhatsApp by people. How does that video get to the WhatsApp group in Uganda and is forwarded millions of times? So, and we think that's normal. It's not. It's not normal that we are getting fed through some kind of information highway with all these narratives. And the people who are feeding us, perhaps for them, it's about the money they make. And for us, we are now legislating and having all these discussions to oppress our own people without taking into account the bigger world in which we exist.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. And there's a comment from someone in the audience about the role that that members of the diaspora can play in sort of challenging a lot of this information that is then transposed into African context, and sort of how we can make sure that we're not, like you said, just copying and pasting WhatsApp posts and applying them to places that they're not intended. Even at the places that they are intended, they are challenged and problematic and kicked out of the discourse, but then taken to Africa. But thank you for that, Dr. Catherine. And Gloria, one of the common pushbacks on this law and sort of a lot of the media and the attention surrounding it is that the government is sort of using this as an opportunity to distract from other challenges that it's facing, or that the country is facing, and that it's not really making as much progress on. Just from in your opinion, what are other things that you'd rather be seeing the government expend all of this attention and resources and energy on that the country is dealing with?
Right. So first of all, we're having this conversation I would say 2 years coming out of the pandemic. And in the middle of the pandemic, at the height of the pandemic, Uganda faced, not that it really faced, but I think because we were much more vulnerable and our non-functioning systems and infrastructures were more exposed. So a lot of things went unchecked. And I think that for me, the most heartbreaking thing for all of us is that none of the attention that the anti-homosexuality bill is getting, or the attention that gay people or lesbian people are getting right now, is misguided. First of all, it's misguided. But I also believe that when the government is talking about protecting the family, protecting the children, as if children who are gay or queer, or children of queer people are not children, it goes against their own commitment to actually protecting children, right? So at the height of the pandemic in 2020, we saw a high increase in teenage pregnancies all over the country because schools were closed. And I think that also further shows how unsafe homes are for young girls. We had over 300,000 cases of teenage pregnancies that were registered. And living in a country like Uganda that does not heavily rely on documentation, I believe that there were more. right? But those came and they went. We made noise about it. We were very concerned. We were very heartbroken. Blogs, international media wrote about it. I mean, we were also one of the countries that took the longest to come out of the lockdown or to open our schools again. So again, young girls and women were, stuck with their abusers. And we did not see this kind of concern around family, around children, around, protecting children come out at that time. So again, it just shows that the government is scapegoating its responsibility to protecting children of Uganda using using irrational fears and morality card and scapegoating queer people in Uganda. But also beyond that, when we talk about the infrastructures that were exposed, we are one of the countries with the highest maternal mortality rates, right? And that is again because our healthcare systems are broken, they're ailing. This shows up in the ways in which we even plan for healthcare, or the ways in which we allocate funds from the national budget to healthcare. In 2022, some of the studies that we did around the budget for Uganda, it showed that the biggest funds that are going to healthcare, and more specifically SRHR for women, was foreign aid. And yet we had a budget of over $5 trillion. And again, that shows you that the government that is concerned about its people, that is concerned about its people's lives and, like the future, it does not reflect in the ways in which the policies are made. I could go on and on and on and on. When we're talking about the transport system in Uganda, it is pretty much non-existent. But also recently we got slapped by over 40 new taxes that were introduced by the Uganda Revenue Authority. And all of this, of course, they affect the poor people, the marginalized people, the people that are living at the periphery of society, but also the more vulnerable people, and in this case, the criminalized people, the LGBTQI persons, right? So in a sense, Uganda is saying, we are protecting our people, but also we are not protecting our people. And there are many issues that I believe that with this homophobia, with this state homophobia and this act, I believe that there are so many issues that have been ignored, and most of this has been attack that has been used not just at the country level, but at a global level. We are at the brink of losing our planet. We have a global climate crisis, but instead of people that are making policies and fund and people that are actually in positions of resource redistribution, they're also ignoring that and concentrating on the one thing that does not in any way affect the planet or affect the people that they live with. So generally at a global level, yes, we are scapegoating queer people instead of actually, concentrating on the things that we should be concentrating on. Yeah.
No, thank you. And that's unfortunately a story we've heard, I think, one too many times on the continent, sort of a misalignment of priorities. But before we get into some questions, I just wanted to see if we could maybe try to end the discussion on a more practical note, or maybe a more encouraging note, and say and a question for all three of you. If a person that listened to this discussion, I got a little concerned about, because like we said, we may be discussing Uganda right now, but I think a lot of the continent is trending towards laws in this vein. From a person who listened to this discussion, I got a little concerned about the possibility of special interest groups in my country kind of hijacking discourse to the extent where they're able to affect policy, or just worried about legislation that I find truly myself indefensible. How do I how am I able, if at all, to affect the situation at home? How can I affect, be it discourse or policy directly, or sort of how do I not feel like insignificant in the entire process of living in a place where the law says that you have to go to jail if you're gay? I'll start with you, Richard.
Very interesting question. I think one of the things is that regardless of the situation, I think we should always speak out whenever we see injustice. And speaking out doesn't require you to be a member of parliament, doesn't require you to be a leader of a certain organization. You could just be a club leader in your school. You could effect change from where you are. So I think really speaking out is really key and a key principle here. But also it's always important when it gets tougher, instead of feeling the burden alone, I think working in coalitions and really identifying with other movements is one thing that is really important. And if there's anything that the LGBT community in Uganda has done excellently, is always working across movements, but also the fact that there have always been other people who have come on board to really support the community. And I think every time things get, if anybody you want to be part, but you feel like you can't carry this cross alone, it's really important to also identify other like-minded individuals and work closely together. But sometimes you don't have to be in public to actually push for change in policy. Not everyone can speak out openly, but the other venues, you could write opinion pieces that really speak to the issues. Some people can express themselves in poetry. Use that. You can use music. Use that. So I think always it's important that regardless of where you are, when you see an injustice, please speak out. And there is no one single way of actually dealing with it. But I think utilizing whatever you have and whatever you have in your means to actually speak out, that's the only way we're going to really push out and deal with these policies that take our rights. But also on a personal level, I think just realizing that you're not alone is really important, that there are other people, not just in your country, but across the continent and the world, that may be facing this same situation. But I think also understanding that someone is trying to do something about it, but also you being part of that change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. And to you, Gloria, how do we retain agency on these issues that we think are important as individuals?
Thank you, Tunde. I think that it's very important that as we're having these conversations, as we are spotlighting Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Burundi, it's very important that we tether these conversations and these issues, rightly so, like Richard put, to also where they're coming from. And I like the fact that somebody in the chat mentioned about the role of the diaspora people, or people that are living in the diaspora, what they can do for the community in Africa to continue holding, excuse me, to continue holding each other accountable, to hold the institutions that we work with, that we identify with, that we somehow contribute to accountable. The Center for Feminist Foreign Policy recently released a research that shows over $75 million is going to anti-LGBTQI work. And this is taxpayers' money. This is work that is from, governments and institutions that are claiming to be feminist, that are claiming to also be, in defense of human rights, that also are actually coming out to put strong statements against such violations. But at the back of it, they're also giving money to organizations and groups that are, that are advancing such violations and draconian laws. So I think that it's very important for us to remember that and to tether all of these issues to where they're coming from. I like that Richard said, we are not existing in a vacuum. Ugandan issues did not just fall from Uganda, they come from everywhere. And as we exist in a heteropatriarchal capitalistic world, we're definitely going to fall into loopholes of systems that keep exploiting people. I also just want to say that we cling on to hope, right? Because without hope, we wouldn't be doing this work. Without hope, Tunde, Dr. Catherine, Richard, and everybody in this room wouldn't be here, would be hiding under our beds or just in a state of constant despair. But we have hope that right now at this moment, there are people that are going to come after us that will be living in a much safer world, in a much more affirming and accepting world. And I think that for me, that hope is very important, even though I may not see the goal. So let's hold on to hope, and as an act of discipline, not necessarily as an emotion or a feeling, because this, if we're to hold on it as an emotion, I mean, I don't think we would hold on to it for a long time, but just not understanding that this is a discipline, this is what we have to do, and we must wake up and do it. It's going to carry us forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gloria. And Dr. Catherine, please bring us home.
Yeah, I mean, I think people have asked me on social media, don't you fear being arrested when you go to Uganda? I said, maybe I'll be arrested, but maybe I won't. Maybe that's the other thing. So I think we have to reach a point of asking ourselves, like, how much more afraid can we be? And that today it's the LGBTQI community, and tomorrow it's something else. There are some things, we are on really many dangerous slippery slopes, and if we let one slope go, then we may come back after 3 years and say we should have seen this coming, and we didn't. So even though we are not doing it for people who are not us, at least we can do it for ourselves, because at the end of the day, oppression can be justified in many different ways. And if one community is a scapegoat, another community is likely to be a scapegoat at some other time. So that is, for me, what keeps me going. But fundamentally, for me, there's a bigger picture. And my advocacy is around decolonization and the place of Africans and our history and our place in the world. And I see the same forces that have kept us behind for many, many decades. The same forces are now being repackaged and are being used, for other purposes. So we have to keep going. We have to be bold. We have to be brave, even though there might be consequences. But you also have to ask ourselves that maybe there might be no consequences, and we can't be captive to fear. But having said that, I've said this before. I don't know who we is, but as I said, we need to be better organized, because there are much bigger forces. You had the resources coming. The same resources are not coming to fight for LGBTQ rights. There are more organized forces. They might be, they're tapping into some kind of groundswell of culture and understanding and knowledge and misinformation. There are bigger forces, and we're sort of playing catch up. And we need to be better organized to play offense, because as I've said, things keep on slipping away. And sometimes you feel like we need at some points to arrest this situation, which is, there are many forces: misogyny, violence, racism, so many things which we thought had been resolved are coming up and being normalized and being accepted. And people are winning elections in governments based on these things that we thought had been resolved even in Western countries. So we are fighting bigger forces, and I think we need to be better organized. And for me, it's starting from our Africanness. Who are we as Africans? What's our identity? So whether it's the education system, whether it's the role of religion, whether it's our culture, there are things we need to start doing now that, as Gloria said, may not benefit our generation. They may benefit our children and our children's children. But so we have to start somewhere, and we cannot be discouraged, because Africa is ours. And we shall die as Africans, in spite of everything.
Incredibly well said. Thank you, Dr. Catherine. I think we have a few minutes. We can do 2 or 3 questions from the audience. I'm just going to read them out, and we might not be able to get 3 answers to each question. So whoever feels the most qualified to answer any of the questions, just kind of jump in. The first one we'll do is, How best can we be in solidarity with the Uganda LGBTIQ plus community without exposing them to further harm?
We have a convening for equality. We have a convening for equality, a coalition that brings together LGBT allies and partners together that is working and pushing against this law. And through that, I think it's important that any individual partners who want to support the community, I think it's a safe way to really have those conversations. But I also want to say that whatever decision you want to do in terms of supporting the community in Uganda, always consult with activists on the ground. Don't make a statement, don't demonstrate before you engage, because then you don't know what your action will be doing in terms of backlash. So always be in touch with local context. Thanks.
Thanks, Richard. We can do about one or two more. The next one is whether or not the Ugandan constitution has a law as to the right to health, which promotes access, and whether this comes in conflict with this law, and whether or not the constitution would supersede this in that case. I'm gonna just point to you, Dr. Captain.
I don't have a legal background, but I think from where I sit there, it's not just about the right to health. There are many other things. So from the right to housing and the right to fair process and the disproportionate, because the same penalties that are in this law are not the same for heterosexual, crimes. So there are so many things which are wrong, really, so many things which are wrong. And so it's not just the right to health. The right to health is very strong because I think there's somebody who won a case against the government for a maternal death. So there are things there in the Constitution. And my hope is that the law will be thrown out because there are so many things which are unconstitutional about it. But of course, I don't have a legal background. It's just my own understanding and interpretation of what fundamental human rights are and how this law goes against them. So there's hope, and maybe people have asked how they can help. I think Richard is better placed to put the links at the websites or names of these organizations. At some point, I saw a link of an organization which was even fundraising. I think they are part of the legal challenge. So I don't know how public it is and how public it should be, because it could be promotion. So there are all those considerations, and that's what Richard said, that it's good to consult because you might do more harm than good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think going through organized groups is good, and I'm optimistic that the law will be thrown out on constitutional grounds.
Yeah, great, thank you. And Richard, if you're comfortable, if you wouldn't mind throwing links in the chat, or even your socials in the chat, just so people can follow you. I know you post a lot about this on Twitter, so at least to have a resource to be connected to how they can help our organizations as well. That would be great. And also we will follow up with emails with resources as well. And the last question, I think, and I still think is an important one, is the extent to which we're able to hold sort of the regional institutions accountable for these kinds of things, right? So does it matter that when a lot of these things come up, we're rarely asking, what does the AU think, right? What does ECOWAS think, or what does, and I think that's not insignificant, right? And I wonder, do you think there is a larger role for these institutions, or on things like this, do they become sort of more obsolete? It's the last one, so I'm going to go with Gloria on this one.
Without a question, I do think that much as we are also, disappointed in the ways in which institutions and instruments like the AU are holding the continent, I think that there is a place for us to continuously push against some of these things, to see that they are prioritized. I know that for a fact, right now there is talks around the East African, the IALA Assembly, to also bring up a bill that is anti-LGBTQI for the entire region, right? Because already there's I mean, they're coming up, they're popping up in Kenya, Tanzania. A few days ago, people were arrested and prosecuted for 30 years in prison for just grounds of suspected being, gay. In Burundi, about 24 people were arrested who were, giving HIV, SRHR information, but because they were doing it in a comprehensive way, they were arrested and their court hearings are still going on. I could go on and on about the other countries within our region where we are coming from, but I think there definitely is a place for us to do that. The question, I think, is how, and like how successful is it if we can't hold accountable places like the EU or the UN, that we still see we still see them funding and being in support of groups that are also funding this kind of work. So in a way, I have not answered the question, but for me, it's important that we keep asking, like, how do we not give up? Because by the time we do, then we've completely lost the battle. So I know that it's all gloom and doom, but there is always hope for us to keep pushing against these ramifications, even at an international and regional level. Yeah.
Thank you, Gloria. I think that is a perfect place to end this discussion. I want to first say an incredible amount of thanks to our panelists. I really appreciate you guys for volunteering your time, expertise, and effort to do this, and we really are appreciative of this. And to the audience, thanks for joining us on a Thursday afternoon or evening for some of you, I imagine. Please continue to follow our panelists. They are on top of this issue. We will continue to try to be. I'm sure they can all connect you to resources, and we will also try to do that about how you can stay involved in the issue and give support to groups who are working on it as well. We look forward to seeing you at the next thing, and thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you.
Home isn't just where we're from. It's the sounds that move us, the stories that shape us, and the flavors that heal us. It's the communities that connect us, the ones that hold us down, the ones that raise us up. Home is a feeling we all know. So if you're looking for it, you can always find it here. The Africa Center. Home is here.
Robin, it feels like we might be clear.
Yeah, I think all the attendees.
Yeah, the attendees are gone. I don't know where.